Hi all, okay, the live stream has begun. I'm gonna start letting everybody in and start the recording. Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome, we'll begin in a few moments. Okay, welcome all and thank you for welcome all and thank you for joining today's Knowledge Cafe. The Knowledge Cafe at the School of Cities is a monthly speaking opportunity for the tri-campus community at the University of Toronto to share the analysis, highlights, and findings of the research on a theme that is important and relevant to cities. To begin, let us acknowledge this land on which we gather today. For thousands of years, Takaranto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. The purpose of Knowledge Cafe is to provide a platform for our faculty, students, and researchers to share solutions towards creating sustainable and equitable cities and integrating justice at the forefront of our activities. We are reminded to include Indigenous wisdom, insights, and ways of knowing that are embedded in community practice. I am pleased to turn to Professor Karen Chappell, our director at the School of Cities, to introduce Fadi Masood in today's topic.
Thanks so much, Cecilia. And thank you all for coming today for what promises to be an engaging and wonderful talk by one of our colleagues at the School of Cities, Fadi Masood. Fadi is an assistant professor of landscape architecture and urbanism at the Daniels faculty at the University of Toronto. He's director of the Center for Landscape Research. And he is a grantee at the School of Cities and also one of our constant advisors and mentors for our students. So we're always so grateful to have him in our family. Fadi's research and design work engages the landscape as an operational force in shaping urbanism. His work aims to establish relationships between large-scale dynamic environmental systems, social equity and vulnerability, design, and the instrumentality of planning frameworks, policies, and codes. Today's discussion will look at the untapped potential of the parks in towers in the park. Many of these tower neighborhoods were built from the 1950s to the 1980s based on universal modernist principles of site planning and building layout. The park portion of the tower in the park has been deemed problematic, anti-urban, and undervalued for decades. So Professor Masood is going to help us understand better. Welcome.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Cecilia. So let me just jump in here. 1 second. Yeah. So now when I share my full screen, I won't be able to see your faces. So if at any point, let me know if there are issues with the slides. Can everybody see? Everything looks okay?
Great.
All right, perfect. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Before I begin too, I just want to acknowledge the incredible team that has been working on this project with me throughout the last 2 years or so. It's still pretty much a work in progress, but Karen Smith, Oya, Merkan, Blake Poland, John Robertson, Paul Kushner, Imara Rolston, and Marianne Tucci have all been instrumental in letting this work move forward. I also want to thank an incredible team of research assistants who have been diligent in pushing this project. This includes Garrett Morgan, Alexandra Scheinbaum, Nadia Chan, Tina Chui, as well as Irene, Patrinos Luis, and finally Ying. So thank you so much for being here. The project really started in 2019 in some form or another when the first comprehensive report on climate change in Canada was released. This multi-volume federal report described in detail for the very first time the impacts of climate change on Canada and what changes are projected in the future. The findings concluded that temperatures in Canada have risen by 2.3 degrees Celsius since 1948. That's almost double the global average. It also points to a shift in precipitation patterns where some regions of the country are facing more severe droughts, while others will be facing more extreme rainfall. In Toronto's case, the impact of climate change means that we will be having extended heat waves, more extreme weather in both the winter and summer with observable changes, including more frequent flooding and ice storms. Some key statistics from Toronto's 2016 greenhouse emissions report, it estimates that close to 50% of our emissions come from heating and cooling our buildings. 41% comes from transportation and 11% come from waste management. In that regard, another report by Transform TO titled Climate Action for a Healthy, Equitable, and Prosperous Toronto found that 78% of the city's residents are concerned about climate change, 82% are aware of the links between climate change and extreme weather, 92% agree that it will threaten their personal health and well-being, 91% agree that everyone should reduce their emission, and nearly 50% simply don't know what we need to do to address climate change. So you see here a kind of tension between the idea that there is a kind of concentration of problematic issues happening emerging from our built form. And then on the other hand, a kind of awareness of the challenges and a lack of understanding of what is possible to deal with the situation. So following a lineage of federal, provincial, and municipal policies since the founding of the country, which is what this timeline is showing, Toronto's first resilience strategy was released later that spring in 2019. And this timeline of municipal, provincial, federal policies range from 1805 to 2020 and shaped the legislative structure that informs this resilience strategy. I won't go into much detail of what is in there, but the two main stressors that were identified are social equity through mostly the provision of affordable housing and climate shocks through heat and urban flooding as both being the most challenging impediments to the city's resilience. Year after year, Toronto has been facing more hot days and more historic rainfall and extreme precipitation that has been causing massive localized overland or pluvial runoff, as well as an increased number of hot days. So the local long-term forecast for Toronto calls for hotter, wetter, and wilder weathers over the next 50 years. This summer, Canadians suffered under extreme conditions brought on by the summer heat domes and wildfires and floods, and it all kind of seemed pretty apocalyptic at some point, especially after the IPCC report that was released in August of that year that also points to these kind of extreme conditions. Interestingly enough, John Lornick of Spacing Magazine wrote that summer, given the increased dire news about climate change, including the release of the IPCC's latest report, one could reasonably ask why the planning profession insists on casting shade on shadows. It's deeply entrenched pro-sun bias. Excessive shade, according to planning policies, guidelines, and protocols, are considered problematic and must be first measured and then minimized as a condition of approval by all new developments. He also writes that city council and the city and council should find ways to incorporate a positive expression of shade and shadow policy in its environmental and carbon reduction strategies. He claims, he asserts that Transform TO, the city's long-term in Transform TO's long-term climate adaptation plan, it does not contain a single reference on the importance of leveraging shadows and shade to passively co-building streets and other public spaces. So in addition to a robust tree planting strategy and a better understanding of how our urban fabric could be thought of as a kind of passive system for reducing heat, we can start to think of these things in kind of conjuncture, where some of the studies like street trees have proven to be able to reduce surface temperatures to up to 10 degrees Celsius in the daytime. While heat is an increasingly pressing challenge, urban flooding is also one of the most difficult challenges that our cities are facing. So, at some points, we're getting more than 5 inches of rain that would fall during short periods of rainstorms in what the Danes coined as a cloudburst events. And this issue of urban flooding was identified as the utmost sustainability challenge in the 21st century and the costliest hazard to Canadian municipalities. And cities are rendered particularly vulnerable to flood damage due to impervious services, aging infrastructure, and the concentration of populations and property assets. In Canada, most existing flood planning policies have prioritized riverine or coastal flood management and overlooked the costlier risk from pluvial surface flooding associated with urban runoff. In Toronto, urban flood damage has increased significantly in the last 20 years, with over $20 billion in damages, making it one of the city's top resilience priority actions. These are just some clips from social media where people were having a bit of fun doing about a bunch of collages of Toronto's Union Station, which year after year has faced multiple flooding problems, even during its renovation. What I wanted to show here is a series of maps that also help point to some of these kind of questions that we are critically beginning to assess. So this map on the left shows Toronto's glacial topography, where the network of deep ravines that cut through the city. And on the right is a map of all these little red dots that represent either a basement flood or a street flood call. And these red dots also happen to be in some of Toronto's lowest income neighborhoods. You'll also notice a higher concentration of flood calls on the northwest side of the city because of two things. One, there's this geologic ridge that has been created by the glacial lake Iroquois shoreline that traps moisture from predominant southwest winds. And the second is a huge concentration of impermeable surfaces around Pearson Airport's industrial logistical zones. So this resilience strategy calls out the need to understand our physical terrain in relation to urban development and to invest, preserve, and enhance networks of green open space and parkland as a form of mitigating both urban heat island, but also flooding. So thinking of these green spaces as a kind of critical urban infrastructure that is both civic and functional. The second key pillar of the strategy is establishing a connection between social equity and resilience, where the disappearance of Toronto's middle class is seen as a huge risk. You can see in these maps that were readapted by U of T professor David Helchinski, Toronto's shrinking middle class in yellow, and the rise of the lowest average income bracket in red and the highest individual income brackets in blue over the last 40 years. At the intersection of these two issues, housing and climate resilience, is the city's Tower Renewal initiative, which was identified as the single most pressing urgent issue to ensure the city's resilience. So tower neighborhoods are comprised of dense rental apartment buildings that are generally surrounded by mature trees and lots of permeable green open space. Over 1 million middle and low income Torontonians live in 1,200 aging towers that dot the region. And these are towers that are either 35 years and older and are often the first home of many of the city's immigrant populations. These towers were designed and built with modernist architectural principles in mind. So these were idealized urban forms in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And they mostly sit in or adjacent to huge swaths of green open space. Some were built on top of the ruins of the Victorian fabric of the city, like St. Jamestown, which was also near the Rosedale Ravine, but replaced an extension of what we now know as Cabbagetown, what we now know and love as Cabbagetown. So over time, this type of development came to be notoriously considered anti-urban and as the tower in the park problem. That's not to say that there are plenty of issues with how these things developed over time. But in Toronto's case, unlike many of the urban renewal initiatives south of the border, many of our tower communities were actually built in the suburbs, on greenfield sites near ravines, where there are plenty of issues that emerge later on in time. When these buildings were proposed, the idea was that access to green space and open space is something that should be considered as a high quality quality of life benchmarker, something that remains true today. Absent a little bit from our discussion also is how projects or how initiatives and policies might also start to think about the relationship of these tower renewal initiatives and climate change mitigation and adaptation as sort of interlinked, and how green space that surround these tower communities, especially during the pandemic lockdowns or during heat waves, that access to these spaces, both if we're physical or even just adjacent to them, are seen as a form of critical social infrastructure. Over time, further densification with mixed use or market rate condos has been seen as a kind of de facto semi-desirable solution for dealing with the tower renewal initiative. Here's an example of the Parkway Forest community in North York, where the logical densification argument does make sense, especially due to the proximity to subway transit and other forms of transportation. But we're starting to ask a little bit more about how does the loss of green open space, what does it mean to the local residents of these towers? Are we losing any ecosystem services by building on top of mature tree canopies? There's no going back once a woodlot has been bulldozed for development. Even when the landscape matures, it doesn't fully replace what was there before. Most tower renewal initiatives have kind of ignored this public and private open spaces that surround the towers and have focused more, rightfully so as well, on the mechanical retrofit of the structures themselves. So our project is not asking what should be prioritized, but instead, what are the co-benefits of looking at both as integrated opportunities? And if redesigned properly, can the spaces around towers be places of immense social, environmental, and health value? Especially if we think beyond the private property parcel itself to understand the unexplored co-benefits and linkages between tower neighborhoods, green space, and nearby parks, ravines, shopping plazas, schoolyards, schools, community centers, and street right-of-ways. Again, this comes on the heels of findings from Statistics Canada, which was just released this week, that shows that 3/4 of large and medium cities in Canada have lost green space, significantly lost green space in the last 20 years. So even if we're thinking we're building more parks and expanding green space, in fact, we have been considerably losing green spaces in cities. Another CBC and Statistics Canada analysis from the summer also proved that higher median income neighborhoods in Canada have more extensive tree coverage. So the wealthier the area, not only the higher the tree count, but also the greater diversity of species. So we're really beginning to see clear inequities when it comes to green space in our cities, both happening at a record pace, but it's also exacerbating a lot of the kind of socio-ecological issues that we are beginning to understand. So as such, one of the main goals of our Urban Challenge group funded by the School of Cities was to define and identify attributes that link social equity to physical urban resilience and shared public green open space assets and other public realm infrastructures, rendering visible the undervalued or unexplored socio-ecological co-benefits of green open spaces in dealing with climate-related shocks, such as flooding and extreme heat, as well as chronic socio-economic stresses, such as rising inequality, lack of shared public spaces, and unaffordable housing. We're also aware of the importance of engaging with issues of equity and power when talking about this issue because of the threat of climate gentrification. In this context, we mean the population displacement in response to climate change adaptation that is yet to be fully explored in Toronto and in Canada in general. This really wonderful report by the University of Minnesota on sharing the benefits of a greening city says, urban green spaces and parks are uneven landscapes. They embody generations of investment practices that have perpetuated racialized disinvestment in low-income, Indigenous, and communities of color while investing resources in wealthy white neighborhoods. The recognition of these historical harms, coupled with a better understanding of the benefits of green infrastructure, has led cities to pour money into investments that are green and sustainable. But through green gentrification, a lot of these parks, greenways, and other green investments threaten to reproduce the same historic inequities that cities are reportedly seeking to remedy. So in the midst of a chronic and increasingly severe affordable housing crisis, these pressures are becoming even more acute. So addressing green gentrification does not diminish the importance of green amenities as worthy investments. Rather, it merely expands the realm of considerations that these investments must take into account so that they can do the justice work that they claim to do. So as we started this investigation, these two things were really kind of front and center in our minds. We noted the importance of looking first in parts of the cities that are most equity seeking. In 2014, the city of Toronto designated 31 neighborhoods as priority areas in need of stronger support, known as neighborhood improvement areas. And they considered multiple factors like unemployment, high school graduation, walkability, and access to community space and healthy foods. These are disproportionately found in the Black Creek subwatershed. The Black Creek subwatershed also contains the highest proportion of visible minorities. It is also one of 3 subwatersheds with the lowest canopy cover in the city, less than 20% and decreasing. Between 2008 and 2018, so in 10-year period, the Black Creek watershed also, the canopy cover there also decreased from 24% to 19%. As mentioned earlier, trees provide a range of benefits, such as reducing air pollution and shade. They also suck carbon from the air and release oxygen. And here you can kind of, again, see how the Black Creek subwatershed is not doing so well. The other one is in Scarborough. Each of these little black dots is a tower community, just for your reference. So we started to do some correlation mapping as part of this exercise. So we mapped things like air pollution and the location of the tower neighborhoods. Again, they're the little black dots you see on the screen, where you can clearly see lower concentration of particulate matter and air pollutions in the green networks of ravines and higher pollution along the highways and industrial zones. We then also mapped the concentration of parking lots and impermeable hard surfaces in relation to tower neighborhoods. So the purples and blues are paved areas like parking lots, highways, roofs, warehouse roofs, where water is not allowed to infiltrate. And these are areas that absorb a lot of heat from the sun and store it. Again, you see a direct correlation between the lack of green space or impermeable surfaces and surface heat and the tower neighborhood. So the redder the shade here, the hotter the temperature is. For example, the average surface temperature in the summer on the same day can range from plus 33 degrees Celsius in some neighborhoods to less than 20 degrees Celsius in some of the ravines. So as I mentioned, the Black Creek subwatershed became really important for us to look at because we found a high concentration of all of these issues becoming abundantly clear. So in these orange dots that you see are some of the tower clusters that are either strung along floodplains, as you see on the map of the left, and on the right, you see also a series of maps that also represent median household income. So the darker the red, the lower the income. And so as part of the exercise, we also began to catalog the location and condition of parks, public parks, and open space assets that surround these tower neighborhoods. So, if we're starting to think about the property boundaries of where intervention or change could happen, we thought the first and smartest place to look is on existing public land that is owned by, the city and by the TRCA. And this is to begin to better understand the latent and unexplored benefits and linkages between tower communities and nearby parks. Those adjacencies started to give us a lot of clues on how and where climate retrofits and adaptation could be integrated into the urban fabric as a whole, especially how we can begin to propose, if we are to, any sort of resilience strategies that correlate with socio-demographic data, such as age, income, and need. These varied in places where towers could meet ravines versus towers that met a public park, where towers met hydro corridors or met up against a large strip mall filled with big boxes near a highway off-ramp, where towers met rail corridors and conservation lands, or when they share schools and community centers. So by doing this kind of cataloging and mapping, we aim to search for opportunities for either preservation or enhancements or retrofits to think about the existing tower renewal initiatives in relation to reducing urban flooding, retaining healthy tree canopies, reducing urban heat island effect, and maximizing the potential of public activation and use. So before we get to co-creating solutions to the problems above, we had to get a better understanding of each other's perspectives, realities, and languages as a good foundation for moving forward. And to that extent, we were super lucky and fortunate to work with the Center for Connected Communities, who helped us bring together a diverse set of players through a series of what we called knowledge exchange events. Participants included resident climate champions from 10 tower communities, city and government officials, and academics from U of T. Each in their own way, the participants were seeking to have influence in mitigating the effects of climate change. Each of these players had critical knowledge and wisdom on the co-creation of solutions to the problems we're all trying to solve. In each session, we got a treasure trove of information at the nexus of both climate action and lived experience, which was really critical for us. And this process helped us find common language to shed light on where climate action is possible. And based on what we heard and learned from our mapping, cataloging, and knowledge exchange events, we constructed this illustrative, prototypical cross-section of a kind of Toronto's inner suburbs. It is a highly detailed illustration that includes all the various interfaces between tower neighborhoods, for example, and noisy, loud, and polluted expressways. It includes what we learned about in strip malls and the parking lots of shopping plazas and how they often function as informal but important gathering spaces, as well as the many challenges they've posed when it comes to comfort, access, and safety. We learned about the very important but precarious edges of towers and ravines, from the fencing to the illegal dumping to the illicit activities, but also the beautiful views from units that face them and the mental health benefits they offer to some of the residents. We learned about how some neighborhoods and demographic groups had very different social and psychological relationships with ravines. While many see them as an asset, many tower buildings actually turn their backs to the ravine and place either parking lots or garbage disposal bins in lieu of any kind of amenity or gathering space or access to the ravines themselves. We learned a lot about the surface parking lots and the huge swaths of fences, the huge amounts of fences between buildings that demarcate private property boundaries, but also make circulation that much harder for residents. We learned about the kind of fenced off swimming pools or lawns or swimming pools that were filled with concrete that were kept off limit from residents. And we asked if there were opportunities for activating, the first floor of buildings or the underground parking garages or these kind of fenced off lawns for social activities. We learned about the community centers, libraries, gyms, restaurants, daycares, and elderly centers that often provide reprieve from the heat in the summer, but more importantly, are super critical social community spaces. We looked beyond the tower neighborhoods to search for opportunities to link to broader networks like bike paths, the hydro corridors, or transit lines that increase mobility option and provide spaces for additional regional activities. This was, again, an exercise in visually synthesizing and foregrounding many of the spatial possibilities that we learned about through the knowledge exchanges and through our mapping. So following our many discussions, we clustered these possible actions into 3 design themes. The first, and by no means are these exhaustive, the first is environmental green infrastructure, where strategies, interventions, and tools use green and dynamic living matter as a form of infrastructure. The second is expanding shared social common public spaces in public and private settings. And finally is to find ways to increase access and mobility, giving people more choices and options and flexibility in how they get around the city. We're now in the process of translating some of these themes in what we're calling climate design action cards, if you will. And these are kind of reflective of the 3 themes I mentioned. And they can be thought of as gradients of tactical interventions. Some are high impact, low cost, and medium in scale and scope, like increasing access to the ravines or allocating space for growing food. Others are high cost, high impact, and take a long time to complete, like retrofitting buildings, streets, and expanding green spaces. Again, many of these action cards are largely based on recommendations that we learned, and they range from community gardens to multipurpose fields to better bus shelters to new and expanded crosswalks to vertical balcony gardens. And our goal for the next step is to work on a finer grain vulnerability mapping and that cross section to then re-engage with the community so we can better understand where and what climate action should be prioritized. I want to end here really quickly by sharing with you a graduate project completed in our third semester integrated urbanism studio at the Daniel faculty, where MLA students Alex, Agatha, Evelyn, and Natasha worked in a projective way to imagine what climate resilient neighborhoods in Black Creek could look like. They started out by illustrating the flood risk, the 100-year storm flood risk in the Rockcliffe Smythe neighborhood, and highlighted the location of the most vulnerable properties near the creek. Worth noting that it does not only is this area frequently flooded, but it's also on average hotter than the rest of the city and has higher population of lower income residents. They started by following a local green frog as he navigated the neighborhood, beginning at the outlet of the Lambton Golf Course and following the frog up the mouth of the channel. The frog begins hopeful as he treks through the urban wilderness, but slowly becomes jaded as he faced issues of pollution, habitat fragmentation, and urban heat island. Their findings reiterated the contention that Toronto's aging stormwater and sewer infrastructure can no longer support the frequently occurring 100-year storms in the neighborhood. The creek here is enclosed with concrete, while many of the adjoining nearby surfaces are paved. Very few, if any, mitigation strategies are currently in place to deal with this significant flooding. An environmental assessment completed over 10 years ago called for the redevelopment of key public spaces along the creek to ensure flood protection, but also to increase public realm access. The team, however, imagined a completely different reality for a lot of the green open spaces along the Black Creek, and specifically as they linked to tower communities nearby as a kind of long range and critical adaptation and transformation of the region. For example, they proposed floodable meadows planted with native grasses to improve infiltration in places that were once parking lots or mowed and inaccessible lawns. And they also, their strategy was further supported by the addition of green roofs and living walls on existing tower buildings and the transformation of streets into blue-green right-of-ways. The designers asserted that making the living landscape more visible to the residents will increase engagement and provide significant benefits as compared to the previously stark segregation of the tower communities from their nearby creek and public spaces. Extensive new pathway systems reduce the physical barriers that exist between residents and open spaces. Floodable civic infrastructure like multifunctional play fields and soccer fields and other game play areas would store and divert water away from the nearby school during high risk flood events. Within the community itself, new flexible spaces are created by modifying existing parking lots to make space for local pop-up markets and playgrounds. They also proposed a new learning center for youth that is constructed as part of the Resilience Community Hub. Elevated paths supported wetlands and increased biodiversity in the lowest part of the site, especially near the city-owned golf course. As you would imagine, these wetlands would become especially critical after heavy rainstorm events. There was also opportunities to expand multi-seasonal programming in new shared greenhouses and other publicly accessible indoor amenities. We come back at the end to revisit the Green Frog, whose urban landscape is one that is both vibrant and a dense community that is adjacent to parks, wetlands, meadows, and blue-green infrastructure that has improved flooding, sucking carbon, reducing urban heat island, cleaning the air, and remedying the pollution as it directly engages the local residents through learning and recreation. In the 2021 iteration of the studio, we saw students tackle tower communities across the site, like this excellent project for Thorncliffe Park. I will share links in the chat right after I'm done for these projects. And I want to end by quoting the authors who said, "Reinterpreting our relationship to nature as being mutual and interdependent brings a new kind of value to the blanket term urban resiliency. So as we move ahead with our project, we are hopeful that this expanded lens of tower renewal sees the urban fabric as an integrated and interconnected part of our urban nature. So thank you so much for listening. And I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much. That was just so fantastic. This work is so important and so powerful. So we're so glad to have you working on it. And we also we're going to be publishing a policy brief about this work in our City Research Insights series. It's coming out next week. So really excited to push the work forward. And so in that vein, I want to ask you to kick off questions, and I hope others will put questions in the chat, but just to kick things off. So suppose the city gets a hold of your research and the new park czar calls you up for advice and says, what can I do? What would you tell the city?
So luckily enough, the city is specifically parks, forestry, and recreation is already thinking about this and thinking about these questions and has been active in beginning to consider both the combination of how particularly the issue of tree canopy coverage and access to green space is something that can come out of parks first, let's say, then transportation services. And they've begun a process of, first of all, cataloging and mapping the issue, which is something that we began doing as part of this project. So there's already collaboration, seeds of collaborations that are happening with parks, forestry, and recreation on this topic. The second is to say a lot of the parks, adjacent parks, public spaces, things that are within the public realm, they're owned by the residents of the city, was also designed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to a very different population than who is using these parks today. So the public realm in general is not reflective of the heterogeneity and diversity of the population that is using these spaces. They are not designed to maximize the full potential of their ecological function, whether it be, in the simplest of terms, what tree species were planted 50, 30, 40 years ago might be very different of what we would be planting today, both in terms of the biodiversity needs and the linkages to native species, and if they're performing to their fullest extent. So very clear recommendations on how we could be changing the management and the design of these spaces. The very last thing is oftentimes, for a really long time, we thought about property boundaries and parcels as a kind of demarcating line between how things are managed and what is happening within them. So now we're starting to think about even how adjacencies, how different land use adjacencies, how a park might have an impact on anything from urban heat island effect to the runoff. If you've got a huge shopping plaza and the rain is now running off into your park, these boundaries that are been demarcated in the past are now being rethought because of climate change. So parks all of a sudden are not just a luxury, or green space in general. It's not just a kind of recreational luxury for single purpose amenity. They're instead a kind of really important piece of critical infrastructure for the city that is slowly being rethought in the same vein as our sewer pipes, as our streets, as our, other kind of public assets. And so those things would require us to think in an integrated way rather than here's what's happening inside the property boundary of both this community itself or this development itself and the nearby adjacent park. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, thank you. Those are three powerful points there. So hopefully the city's listening. I don't know if they're here today, but Brenna, a question.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was such an amazing talk. It was really neat to see everything really animated because I've been, helping to prepare the brief, which we're really excited about as well. I had a question about, private land ownership and how that is implicated in a lot of your work. I understand there is quite a lot of public land, but there's also quite a lot of private land, especially, with the rental towers being rentals. They obviously are owned by, a property management company or some other kind of private landowner. So I'm wondering, what is it that landlords and landowners should be doing, and what kinds of tools do we have to motivate them to do what they need to do so that we can, start moving ahead with this great work?
There's a $1 billion question. And it seems, again, because of, the Tower Renewal Initiative has been going on for a while. It is a really important, powerful tool. There are experts there's been experts who have been dealing with this issue, way longer than I've, probably even been, an academic for that matter. So I think this is a kind of at a crux. This question is really at the crux of the kind of difficulty of this challenge, because on the one hand, the retrofits of these towers, someone's got to pay for. So let's just kind of go back to the kind of mechanical retrofits. So the incentivization of making the buildings more energy efficient, for example, there's a fear that that cost might end up being downloaded onto the residents, therefore gentrifying and making cheap or affordable housing unaffordable for the sake of climate mitigation and adaptation. So that's one of those number one kind of challenge is we recognize there's the need for retrofits, but who's paying for it is kind of one of the bigger questions. When it comes to the landscape side of the open space retrofits, those are way less expensive than mechanical retrofits. It's true that green infrastructure is, kind of not seen in the same way as, let's say, a healthier HVAC, because there's a higher degree of indeterminacy that is being put on here. There's a lot more variables that come into play. But there are things, I think the first seed one of our questions was asking is, are those green spaces reducing urban heat island as it exists? Are the existing 40, 50-year-old trees that surround some of these buildings doing the work that it needs to? And we're starting right now with Karen Smith to map some of these at a much finer grain. So some of our kind of climate scientists on the team, we're starting to kind of zoom into a few communities to actually measure how existing green spaces are performing around some of these towers. So it's almost like you don't need to do anything, just don't cut the trees down. You know what I mean? Or changing your lawn management practices. You will notice that a lot of times mowing the lawn and using leaf blowers that are both disruptive from a carbon point of view, emitting a lot of terrible noise and are kind of gas guzzling machines. If we change our landscape management practices around these towers, could we, on the one hand, both save the landowner money by not asking them to do the same type of landscaping, but instead, can we promote in some of the areas that are inaccessible, things like a native meadow, a grass meadow with pollinator plants, if those are inaccessible. On the other is to say, well, what are the needs of the community? Because we've also learned that depending on where you are in the city and what the community is, sometimes the landlords are actually really open and give full access to residents to use the spaces around. So we've learned, for example, that during COVID, a lot of the residents, these are something we learned in the knowledge exchanges, was that the residents who were very nervous about meeting their neighbors, about their kids playing with each other's indoors, were all of a sudden realizing how important that patch of grass is in front of their house. And it became a place where even vaccination drives were happening, where testing was happening. So those were seen all of a sudden as not just marginal kind of interstitial green spaces, but they became literally the gathering space because they couldn't meet indoors. And so the landlord would be some of the landlords were very receptive and very excited and very open and very sympathetic to this need and actually made it better. Like they added lights and benches and things in a space that would have been a dead zone, while others were really discouraged by this and they fenced the areas even more. So it's kind of very hard to kind of give one singular blanket assessment of every single landlord in all the tower communities, but we know that there are variables. The very last thing I would say is city building code. So we know, for example, that we've got a weed bylaw in Toronto, right, that has encouraged for a while landowners to basically mow their lawn and discouraged any type of rethinking of how your lawns or open space or green space could have a different type of management. And I'll direct you to the work of Professor Nina Marie Lister from Ryerson, who has been challenging this weed bylaw very successfully to encourage a completely different aesthetic, functioning aesthetic for our open spaces. So there are mechanisms that the city could very easily incentivize landowners to change and open up the ground plane around these towers and to activate them in a very simple way. Like we know, like privately owned public spaces, POPs, that are existing every time you've got a new condo being built in the city. A lot of times they create these brand new little pocket parks, especially downtowns, that are privately owned and publicly accessible. This is exactly what this is. However, unfortunately, they are fenced off most of the time. You can't actually walk from one building to the other because there's a fence in the middle. They have parking, surface parking, so it's very unsafe for kids to run around in them. They're often under programmed. There's no eyes on them. So there's a ton of strategies that are really not rocket science, that are common knowledge, that are easily understandable and have been best practices for a really long time to make a lot of those spaces function better, both for the residents, but also be seen as valuable, so that it's not all of a sudden prime land to just put another building in there, right? As has been the case so far with a lot of the retrofits. Sorry, I can get into these stream of consciousness responses that take forever. So feel free to just jump in and ask questions if you have them.
I love that. Thank you so much. We did get a question in the chat from Kira McMaster. How do you see your recommendations integrating into food planning and policy in the city?
It's a great question too. So actually, one of the themes that we heard a lot about from our local champions is issues of food security and a lack of good, healthy food around a lot of these tower neighborhoods. There's issues with even just something as simple as going to the nearby supermarket, like in Thorncliffe Park. You've got to cross oceans of parking lots. You've got to cross these really wide streets in your shopping carts with your 3 kids in the snow. So even just something very simple as access to physical access and options for healthy and good food that is affordable is something that is an issue. So barriers to getting to good food, good healthy food for your community is one. The other is just the location of supermarkets and other places to buy food in. So there's a kind of way to start to maybe correlate, just like how we're correlating tree canopy with income inequality. We can start to correlate mapping of food deserts with income inequality, which we know exist. The other much more pragmatic but interesting solution we heard from a lot of our residents is many want to grow food on their balconies. It is really remarkable how many people have said to us that they wish that they could turn their gigantic balconies into places to grow food. And if there are ways for local residents to gain knowledge, material, help and support in how to do this, including just, care, or, if you live on the southwest side of the building that is in constant sun and heat, burning your tomato plants, versus residents who are living on the kind of east and north side of the building that are getting very little direct sunlight. And again, many times landlords say you're not allowed to do this, or there's a kind of issue with the kind of just the legal underpinnings of some of this. So that's one. The very last recommendation that we heard a lot about is people wanted or are very excited about using interstitial green spaces to grow food locally. So kind of, and there's a lot of these pop-up urban kind of garden farms that people have done in many places, especially along the hydro corridor. So, under the hydro corridor, people have been doing it. But many times, some of the issues are coming from a kind of seasonal perspective. So if people had access to things like greenhouses or kind of seasonal storage places for equipment, things like this, then that's something that, you could potentially get grants from the city for, or from the TRCA. There's been a lot of talk about how we could think about healthy food planning and growing our own food in a lot of these communities that are being seen as a kind of really quick, low-hanging fruit. So if you will, for increasing food equity in some of these tower communities.
Yeah, those are great ideas. And so great to see you connect the dots across the silos. So it's always really inspiring. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on hydro corridors and the use of hydro corridors for urban gardens and parks. And, is there potential here in the region for climate change mitigation?
Yes. So actually, a few years ago, there was a competition. Actually, it's almost like 10 years ago now, called From Mowing to Growing. It was put on by a New York City organizer called Terraform One. And our team, actually a team from U of T, submitted an entry, and we were like one of the top 4 honorable mentions. And I'll put the link in the chat here. And our study specifically looked at turning the entire retrofitting the entire hydro corridors of Toronto into a kind of food growing enterprise. And we measured how many farms that would do and how much food it could offset. And we created this kind of, it's a competition, right? So it's a kind of ideas competition to create an agency called Feed TO, kind of like Transform TO and Create TO. And the idea here was that Feed TO would sort of manage as a public asset entire community gardens that would stretch the entire length of the hydro corridor. So while the air rights are still all managed by Hydro One or the kind of electrical companies, the ground plane would be this kind of continuous urban agriculture. And we just quantified how much food this could create in the city. And so now a lot of these under hydro corridor zones are becoming the Meadowway. I don't know if you have heard about the Meadowway, which is an incredible project also put on by the TRCA to turn the land under the hydro corridor into a beautiful kind of successional meadow that with kind of recreational potential, with paths and other kind of amenities. So that's becoming, seen as a kind of really important, because it has it crosses such a huge transect of the city, right? It goes, especially the hydro corridor that goes from the Rouge River all the way to the Don Valley and beyond. It's this kind of long linear linkage that is kind of wonderfully seen as a kind of potential asset in a kind of new green space network. And along it too are a ton of tower neighborhoods, especially as you get closer to Jane and Finch.
Brenna, did you have a follow-up or?
I just had another question that popped into my mind. So we talked a little bit about, private landowners and what landlords can do. I was thinking about, the University of Toronto as a large institution and, just trying to bring it back, I suppose, to something that's familiar for all of us. Is there anything that the University of Toronto and or other large institutions, is there anything that they specifically can do to contribute to the use of open and green spaces for climate mitigation that's maybe different from what a more simple kind of private landowner would be doing?
Interesting. So, I mean, I know in the U of T Scarborough and Mississauga that are in much more verdant, adjacent to much more green space than we are in St. George campus, for example. They've been playing an incredible stewardship role in protecting and enhancing the nearby green spaces. So U of T Scarborough built this incredible connection down into the ravine that was recently also awarded a Toronto Urban Design Award for both its accessibility design, but also for the first time really allowing students and other members of U of T Scarborough to engage with the ravine in a way that they have not in the past. So that's a kind of on the physical on the physical side of things. But I feel like our role here is kind of a lot more potent in two ways. One is really being advocates in some ways to kind of make and render visible the value of green open space in a way that maybe is not as easily done outside of an academic context. So we, as I mentioned, we've had, the incredible opportunity through this Urban Challenge grant to map and quantify, some of the value of green open spaces, especially in the Black Creek watershed, where we have been kind of really focusing on in a way that maybe the city or other public agencies might not have the time and resources to do. So we're literally handing over everything we've done for them. It's like, use it as much as you can, it's all yours. So that sparked conversations about like, maybe where do we begin to prioritize retrofits, or where do we begin to prioritize new types of investments in green spaces? So does this single purpose baseball diamond that was designed 30, 40 years ago, is it still serving the need that it does for the community nearby? Maybe most of the people who live around it are now elderly, not playing baseball anymore. Maybe it's made up of a socio-demographic group that, would prefer to play another sport. Is it worth us putting, again, I'm being overly simplistic here, but this is one way to kind of describe this situation, is to say, is this park performing to the top of its potential, both from a social perspective and an environmental perspective, and from a financial perspective? And are there strategies, tools, methods, ideas that can much easily retrofit and increase the value of this public space asset, absent an investigation of both of its kind of current limitations, but also its potential? So this is where I feel also maybe designers have a little bit of a advantage in this conversation, is because we're not afraid to imagine the future. So that's why I thought it was really important to show a project by our students, our graduate students at the very end, because I feel like it's not enough to keep reiterating the issues. We all know, or we're quickly learning, or very clearly learning what the issues are, but oftentimes we feel stifled by the issues and never make the leap to render the future, to show ideas, to be projective, to be optimistic. Actually, that's maybe even a more important note, to say, we know this place floods, we know it's hot, we know it has issues. Can we leverage all these issues, all these problems, and imagine a better future, and a more equitable future, a more environmentally friendly future, a more exciting future? Can this issue become a seed for something better? And as designers, we have to be optimistic. Otherwise, what's the point of us imagining the future? So the design process enables, you base it on research and investigations. And I would say as an institution, as a kind of going back full circle to your question, is to say maybe the role of academics, designers in an academic context is to synthesize all that finding, make it graphically digestible to the public. We could have taken all that work and turned it into another report that no one's going to read. But hopefully our drawings and our graphics and our illustrations will draw people in versus turn them off. And then we would redraw this work visually as a projective idea so that it could also make people feel better about their future instead of continuously going through this doom and gloom loop about all the issues that they're facing and not being able to make that leap to think about solutions and visualize those solutions. So I feel like this is where one of our contributions could be, is really synthesize information from various sources in a way that is digestible to a larger audience, but also not be afraid to be projective and not do the analysis paralysis condition that I feel many actors find themselves in.
We're going to have to wrap it up on that inspirational note. No, that's fantastic. I love your ideas for how we move forward. And we love your work. You can see in the chat some comments and excitement. So looking forward to many years of continued partnership to make sure you have the impact that we know you're having already.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for everybody for joining, and thank you, School of Cities, for making this work possible. So take care.
Bye-bye.